Okay, so you get home after shul. Here we go, Friday night. A whole bunch of things that need to be done when you get home after shul on Friday night. So we spoke about yesterday. We spoke about this idea of the first thing that you do is either you bless your children or you sing Shalom Aleichem, and then within Shalom Aleichem, as I mentioned yesterday, each verse is repeated 3 times. Sometimes, depending on where you are, the last verse is not sung at all. And that's, of course, being done just to confuse you and to make you sound ridiculous as you launch into that last verse, all full of gusto and realize that you're the only person who's singing. It probably pays to sort of hold back a second or two just to see what's going to be. After that now inside of, when you've got your little beer corner, you've got your city, you'll see there's a rather long prayer that comes after Shalom Aleichem, which is called Ribon Kol Olamim. Some people say it, most people don't. So, I'm just warning you, if you go to somebody's house and it goes all quiet after Shalom Aleichem and they don't start singing Eishes Chal straight away, then you'll know that, I imagine that the host, one or two things, either he's dropped off and having a little snooze, and then you'll just have to wait a few moments until he wakes up again, or he's saying Ribon Kol Olamim. You know what, a third option, which I just thought about now, is possibly both. He may have started Ribon Kol Olamim and dropped off in the middle, and then you just have to wait for him to wake up, if that's what's going on. But afterwards, what will happen is everyone will launch into Eishes Chal. Eishes Chal, we mentioned yesterday, is a very beautiful poem, comes at the end of Mishlei, of Proverbs. It was written by Shlomo Melech. It's a poem of appreciation and of love for a person's wife. Eishes Chal mi yimtza. It talks about very beautiful concepts at the end. It says Sheker Achein vehevel hayofi isha yiras Hashem. The Vilna Gaon is very famous. Vilna Gaon, he says that Sheker Achein means that that bless you. Sheker Achein means that external beauty is something which is not. It's not real. It's not true. The only thing that is true is when you have a wife who is a Yiras Hashem, when she has, when she is righteous, so then you've got something which is truly beautiful. Bless you.
She could be both.
Oh, for sure, absolutely. I would hope that in your eyes she is both, actually. They say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. One would hope that, it's very often it's impossible to imagine why people find other people attractive, and yet they seem to have very, very beautiful relationships, very beautiful marriages, and that's part of one of the wonders of the world, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates this incredible bond that exists between a husband and a wife. Very often when you go out on shidduchim, when you go out on dates, it doesn't have to be a shidduch, just when you go out on a date, sometimes you can be blown away by the beauty of the person that you're going out with, the physical beauty of the person you're going out with, and yet after you've been out for a few dates, the beauty tends to wane a little bit, because inside she's not as beautiful inside as she is outside. And sometimes you'll go out on a date and maybe you'll feel that the girl is not quite, she's not very pretty, and yet the more you go out with her, the more attractive she starts to become, because as you get to know her and you see the inner dimension of the person, all of a sudden, you realize that it's a joint package, right? And that's really the pshat of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's a very simple idea. It really is. So when you say Sheker Achein ve'elav hayofi, what Shlomo Melech is saying is not that physical beauty doesn't exist, but physical beauty without the dimension of being Yirat Hashem, without the dimension of being righteous, is something which is, doesn't have any worth to it. It's all beauty. Beauty is really an optical illusion. Physical beauty is an optical illusion. Lots of beauty. First of all, lots of beauty comes out of bottles and lotions and all kinds of things. And aside from that, beauty is something which changes as well. Physical beauty. Somebody once mentioned, not very long ago, I was quite surprised at who said it, but they said that Marilyn Monroe, who is considered to be, one of the icons of certainly the 20th century for sure, would never have got a job today in modelling. She wouldn't have been accepted by any modelling agency because her figure was all wrong. Things change. What was once considered to be attractive today is not considered. Something else is considered to be attractive instead. Sheker Achem V'Hevel HaYofi, Isha Yiras Hashem, that we want our wives to be righteous. And when our wives are righteous, then we'll tap into the beauty, the true beauty of who the person is. I mentioned yesterday it follows the Aleph base. Each verse, the first letter of each line is following the Aleph base. Aleph base Gimel all the way down, and Aleph to Taf, it's full of all the brachas that you've got over there. Let's just talk about. We didn't talk yesterday, did we? About blessing the children.
Yes.
Did we talk about it in detail or
No, just
Sort of briefly.
sort of
How
briefly?
you come from
So
when do you back?
oh no, okay. So let's talk about the blessing itself. I don't know if anybody here, if you've had does anyone here have the custom that their parents bless them on Friday night?
My rabbi has done that, and he's blessed not just his children, but some of his the people there.
Oh yeah,
Coin.
that's interesting.
No, he's not. He just considers everyone like your brother and son. I mean, I don't know. He's very interesting. But he's like, would you like a blessing? I'm like, oh yeah, absolutely. It's rabbis. I'm like, yeah, totally. It's like,
You didn't ask the classic Jewish question is it free? Right.
down the road.
Send you an invoice after Shabbos.
Yeah, down the road, there's gonna be an invoice. Like, oh, okay,
Just survive.
now that you have some shekels, you hit that oil rig.
That's right.
Send it on down.
Nothing's free in Turkey.
I don't know. I don't think there are any particular minhagim that are particular to different Eidas. Some people do and some people don't. It's a very, very beautiful custom. I've mentioned this. You must have heard this hundreds of times, but it's something which I think it's a very, very beautiful custom. One of the reasons why it's such a beautiful custom is because it gives you the opportunity as a parent, it gives you the opportunity to bless your children and to give them a hug and give them a kiss, right? Which doesn't sound like such a big deal, but when you've got surly teenagers, then it's not always so easy, especially teenage boys who tend to shy away from having any kind of physical contact from their parents unless they're giving them money. That it's just an opportunity. It's part of the Shabbos, part of the Shabbos ceremony, right? And they just know that it's going to happen, and it's just an opportunity to be able to have a moment together with each child. I think it's a very beautiful thing, I really do. And if you have the custom, then I think you should very much continue it. And if you don't have the custom, I would recommend that, Mitzvah Hashem, when you have your children, that you should take it upon yourselves. You take the boys, you bless them. It's rather interesting. Instead of blessing them that they should be like the forefathers, you bless them that they should be like Ephraim and Manasseh. You say, Simcha Elokim ki Ephraim and Manasseh, that you should be like Ephraim and Manasseh. And then you recite 3 verses that appear in the Torah: Yivarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha, Yu Hashem panav elecha v'yichuneka, Yisa Hashem panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. Is anybody here a Kohen?
That's part of the goal. No.
That's how the Kohanim bless us in the mornings, right? When they get up over there to No, it doesn't matter. Even if it's not what, it makes perfect sense. What he's doing makes perfect sense. Yeah, sure.
Why don't the girls get the same blessing?
Here, so first of all, we don't want our girls to be like Ephraim and Manasseh.
No, Ephraim and
That would
Manasseh,
be
but also
somewhat
that
gender
Hashem will
complicated,
watch
I think.
them and look after them.
Oh, we do.
We only say that to the boys, right?
No! Oh, you chauvinist! Oh my gosh! I can't believe in the 21st century that anybody would say such a thing like that. Are you kidding? Girls and boys are equal, and men and women are equal, and the idea that men and women might be different from each other is absolutely unacceptable in today's day and age. Did you catch all of that? That's okay,
You're being
right?
sarcastic, I see.
Not at all. We're being recorded. No, when you bench your girls as well. However, you use a different formula. The formula of the verses from the Torah is the same, but instead you bench them that they should be like Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, right? Yisamech Elokim, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, which are the mothers, the matriarchs. And then you say, Yivarechecha Hashem Ishmerecha, yes, Yu Hashem panav elecha v'yichuneka, Yisa Hashem panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. So before we go any further, maybe we just need to understand what the difference. Why don't we bench our boys that they should be like Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, if we're benching the girls that they should be like Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, right? If you're going to bench the girls, they should be like the matriarchs. So it would seem to be symmetrical that the boys should be given a blessing that they should be like the patriarchs. There are several explanations that are given. All of them are very beautiful. why do we bench our children? They should be like Ephraim and Manasseh. Who were Ephraim and Manasseh? Ephraim and Manasseh were the children. Oh, you know, here, sorry.
Now you're being rhetorical.
No, not at all.
Joseph's kid.
Joseph's kids. Good. Right? Joe's kids. Ephraim and Manasseh were Joseph's children.
Okay.
Very good, right? Why do we bench our children that they should be like them? If we're already going down into another generation, right? So why don't we bench them to be like all the other children of all of the tribes? So explain like this. One explanation is because Ephraim and Manasseh were born and brought up by themselves in Egypt. They didn't have an infrastructure. Right, once the tribes came down, so there's a whole infrastructure, there was an educational infrastructure, there's a family infrastructure. It's a lot easier to retain your identity when you've got everybody around you helping you to do that. And yet Ephraim and Manasseh managed to retain their identity without that. So we're benching our children that they should have the strength to withstand the culture of the outside world and to be able to retain their spiritual identity. Another explanation that's given is that Ephraim and Manasseh didn't argue with each other. There was no fight. It's interesting. Manasseh was older than Ephraim, and yet Ephraim was given the precedence when it came to spiritual concepts. Ephraim was considered to be more important, and Manasseh accepted that absolutely. There was no sense of jealousy by them. There was no sense of them fighting with each other. So we bench our children that they should also be able to live in harmony together. That's part of the idea. And a third idea is that, there's a concept in Judaism, something called Yeridat Hadorot, which means Yeridas Hadoros is just, each generation is a little more pathetic than the generation before, right? I mean, I'm not suggesting anything, but you see that you people are from a different generation than I am, right? And you're right. You're not really people, but I didn't know what else to call you.
The one place where it's okay to say.
Yeah. I'm okay with that.
You don't have a problem with having sunk even lower,
Yeah, it's okay.
Middle Earth.
Yeah. Yeah. Hobbit's pretty low down.
That's what happens when people drink non-sweetened tea. By the way, I'm just as an aside.
Glad you remember.
Or salty coffee.
So the idea is like this: that every generation is a little weaker than the generation that came before it. However, the generation of Ephraim and Manasseh, those two children, they retained the stature, they retained the levels of the generation before them. That's why they were elevated into the position of being like tribes. So we're also benching our children, we're blessing our children that they should have the strength to be able to retain their identity.
Why was Ephraim upgraded more than...
Upgraded, because it says that from Ephraim, Yehoshua came out from Ephraim, and from Manasseh, Gidon came out. So it says that in spiritual terms, it means that Ephraim has a greater spiritual power to him than Manasseh has got. And then, by the girls, what do? We bench them that they should be like Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, right? What's interesting when you think about it for a moment is that Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah share a common bond with Ephraim and Manasseh, which is what? They were all brought up in an environment which was not conducive to spiritual growth, and yet they overcame that. They grew anyway. Which I think the pshat is like this, that when it's not that I think there's a perfect balance over here. The emphasis over here is that we're trying to give our children the spiritual wherewithal to be able to grow in any environment, exactly like the matriarchs did, exactly like Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah did, and exactly like Ephraim and Manasseh did. Which means in that detail, they're equal to each other. And that's why we're not benching them to be like Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, because it's true that Avram Avinu, of course, he was brought up in an environment which was completely non-conducive to spiritual growth, but afterwards, Yitzchak was already brought up in Avram Avinu's home, and Yaakov was already brought up in Yitzchak and Avram Avinu's home, right? Which means that they've got the infrastructure, and therefore it's not going to help over here with the concept of transferring the spiritual blessing from one to the other. And then what do? We recite those three verses. Yivarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha, Yo Hashem panav elecha v'yichuneka, Yisa Hashem panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. So first of all, the first verse has got 3 words in it. The second verse has got 5 words in it. The third verse has got 7 words in it. If you put it all together, you reach the number 15. 15 is, in gematria, numerical values, 10 is Yud and 5 is Hey, which means that the verses themselves, the number of the verses is going to spell out the dimension of God's name of the Yud and the Hey. So that's another dimension that we're trying to transfer onto the children. But we need to try to understand, if the Kohanim are commanded by God to bless the Jewish people using those 3 verses, obviously they contain everything. And anything that you could possibly want is contained inside of the 3 verses, and that's why we give it over to our children as well. The question is, what's in there? So, Yivarecha Hashem Vishmerecha, which is the first verse, is a blessing of material benefit, right? That we should have material success, physical success. Ya Hashem Panav Elecha V'Yichuneka is talking about spiritual success. Right? Now at this point, one would hope that somebody would be bouncing around on the edge of his seat, not because he needs a bathroom, but because he has a very obvious question.
What was the third one?
Very good, right? That if the first verse is a blessing for physical success, and if the second verse is a blessing for spiritual success, what's left? In this world that we live in, there are really 2 dimensions, right? Physical and spiritual. Almost.
That's the end of it.
The third verse is a blessing that we're blessing our children, or the Kohanim are blessing us, and we're blessing our children, that they should be able to utilize both those blessings of physicality and spirituality in the correct way. Sometimes, too much physicality sometimes it distracts people from what they're supposed to do. And sometimes, when there's too much spirituality, it can also have a detrimental effect. What we're doing is that we're blessing our children that they should have the ability to be able to balance these 2 concepts together in order to be able to use them, each one, to its maximal effect. Now we see all of a sudden, now we understand that what we're doing over here is something incredible. The blessing that we're giving to our children is an all-inclusive blessing. Whatever you could ever possibly want for your child to have is going to be included inside of the blessings that we give them over. So I want to tell you a story. So every time I tell this story, I'm telling you it shakes me up anew. But hey, you wanted to know whether it's okay for your rabbi to bless you, right? Is it okay for him to bless other people that are saying, you can bless anybody. When we used to go and visit my grandfather, when I was a small child, my grandfather died when I was 10, but when I was a small child, he used to, every time we left, and it didn't matter if we went to see him once a week or 3 times a week, sometimes he wasn't around for a few months, he would come to Israel, so he wasn't around at all, but whenever we left, he would bench us in exactly the same way. Didn't matter, it wasn't Friday night, it didn't matter what day of the week it was, when we left he would put his hands on our heads and he would say, using the name of God, Yesimcha Elokim K'Ephraim V'Chemenashe Yivarecha Hashem V'Yishmerecha Yo Hashem Panav Elecha V'Yichuneka Yisa Hashem Panav Elecha V'Yasem Lecha Shalom. If I think hard enough, which is a somewhat difficult thing for me to do, I can still, I can conjure up the feeling of both of his hands resting on my head. I was, of course, a little kid, so I'm like wriggling, trying to get out of there, because then my grandma would give me a treat. And but that's what I remember. My grandfather was one of 13 siblings. Right? In those days, they knew how to make children. And we're going back now quite a while. My grandfather was one of 13 siblings. And from my generation, which is the generation of all the grandchildren, from those original 13, there are exactly 12 frum grandchildren. And they are all my grandfather's grandchildren. Which means that in my generation, not one of those original siblings merited to have frum grandchildren. Why is that? I mean, they were all brought up pretty much the same way. Why is that? So I'm sure, that the reason is every time we left, he would bench us. He would try to transfer to us this spiritual protection in order that we should be able to retain our identity. But I'll tell you something more than that. It's not just, when you're being benched, when you're benching, it's not just you benching, it's something called zchut avot. Zchut avot is a merit of not just the person benching you, but the other people that come before them as well. It's like an accumulation of tremendous merit that's trying to be transferred from one to the other. I'll tell you a story. It's the most incredible story, it really is. My uncle got on a train to go from London to Cambridge. And he's sitting on the train, and a Scottish clergyman, a priest, gets onto the train. And they're sitting in the carriage. There are a few people sitting over there in the carriage, and the clergyman sort of looks around. He said, my uncle said he had this booming voice with a great big thick Scotch accent. And he asked everybody what their names were. And he gets to my uncle, he says, what's your name? So uncle tells him his name, and all of a sudden he looks at him, he says, are you Sam's son? My grandfather was called Shmuel, Samuel. And in the secular world, he was known as Sam. He says, are you Sam's son? So my uncle says, well, yes, I am. And his fellow looks at him and he says, your father is a maniac. And because of him, I'm still alive. He says, wasn't quite sure how to react. How do you react to something like that? And then he told over the most extraordinary story. My great-grandparents came to England. They got taken from Poland. They left Poland by ship, and they got to Scotland, to Glasgow. And like an awful lot of people, they were let off the boat. They were told they were in America. They all bought tickets to go to America. And they found themselves in a foreign city. They had no idea that what they were being told wasn't true. Of course, it's only a third of the journey. And then the captain of the ship just turned around, went back, and brought back another bunch of unsuspecting, refugees that were coming to try to get into England, thinking they were getting into America. He just backwards and forwards. There were lots of them. So that's how we ended up. That's how my great-grandparents ended up in Glasgow. My grandfather as well. When the First World War broke out, my grandfather was drafted into the Scots Fusiliers. Lived in Glasgow. And he got drafted into the Scots Fusiliers, and he got taken off to the trenches in France. I don't know if you know anything about your First World War history. The trenches were the most appalling places to be. The average life expectancy for the officers who were going up over the trenches first was, if my memory serves me correct, I think it was 7.5 days. It was something appalling, the amount of people that died in all of these completely useless battles. And that's where my grandfather was. Just to give you an idea, there was one enormous battle which Baruch Hashem my father wasn't in, and my grandfather wasn't in, called the Battle of the Somme, where I think, if I remember correctly, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, 65,000 people were killed. I mean, the figures were astonishing. And that's where my grandfather was. So they get an announcement one day that they're going to advance. At dawn, they were going to go up and advance to try to take over as much land as possible away from the Germans. Trench warfare was very simple. You had trenches over here, no man's land in the middle, trenches over there, and whoever could grab as much land was the winner at the end. So next morning at dawn, all the whistles start blasting, up they go, over the top, not realizing that the Germans had already started their advance half an hour earlier. And they ended up in the most enormous battle is now taking place, and my grandfather and his little group of about 30 people were all caught. The Germans already advanced, and they found themselves, the Germans behind them and in front of them, they'd been surrounded in the middle of this battle. And they managed to get themselves into a trench, and they're just standing over there, not very much they can do. Right? They're waiting for this whole thing to die down a little bit. It was pretty sure, in the First World War, not very many, not an awful lot of time was taking prisoners, which means it was a lot simpler just to kill people on the way than it was to have to take them as prisoners and take them back to behind the lines. And this fellow said it was pretty clear that they were going to die. They understood that. So all of a sudden, my grandfather starts putting on his tefillin and getting up to daven. So they say to him, they called him Jew boy. Jew boy, what are you doing? So he says, I'm going to pray to the Almighty. So he said that every day in the trenches, because the trenches only came up to chest height, so you had to walk around crouched down the whole time because there were snipers everywhere. If your head peeped up over the top, your brains were blown out. So my grandfather used to put on his tefillin every day and daven, but he used to daven crouched over because you couldn't do it any other way. He says that morning he puts on his tefillin. Not only does he put on his tefillin, but he stands upright. So he said, Jew boy, what are you doing? So he says, I'm going to pray to the Almighty in the way that I'm supposed to. There's no reason to say we're all going to die. There's no reason today why in the midst of this battle, there's no reason why I shouldn't stand upright anymore. And then this Scottish clergyman, he says that my grandfather then opened up his siddur, opened up his prayer book, and he starts davening. He didn't just daven, he was screaming out the words one by one, at the top of his voice, in the middle of this battle. He said, and he finished davening, and then he started on the book of Psalms. Just open it up at the beginning and starts reciting at the top of his voice, Psalm, Tehillim after Tehillim after Tehillim. So this fellow says to himself, he says, him and another guy, they said to themselves in that trench, they said, if one person is going to survive this, it's going to be the Jew boy. He said, so they crawled over to where he was, and one of them held on to one of his legs, and the other one held on to the other leg. He says, and that's how they sat the whole day. He said, when it started to get dark, and the battle died down, he said, there were 3 people left alive in that trench. My grandfather, and one person holding on to his right leg, and one person holding on to his left leg. He said, everyone else was dead. So he looked at my uncle and he says, your father is a maniac. He says, but that's why we're still alive today. And my uncle, he never heard this story before. He said he got off the train in Cambridge. He was supposed to be meeting somebody. He didn't bother. He just got back onto a train that was going back to London. And when he got off the train in London, he went straight back home. He says to him, Daddy, he says, I met a friend of yours. And he told him the person's name. I don't know what this fellow's name was. He told him his name. And then he says, Daddy, he says, he told me a story. He says, is it true? And my grandfather said, yeah, it's true. I don't have any doubt whatsoever that my grandfather is the only one who ended up with frum grandchildren. All of that's coming from that prayer that he gave us, that blessing that he gave us. Every time that we saw him, we got that blessing. It's a blessing, the most incredible potency. It's not just you that's blessing, it's everyone behind you as well that's blessing as well. That's why I tell everybody, if you have the opportunity, Mitzvah Hashem, you get married, and you'll bring beautiful Jewish children into the world in Mitzvah Hashem, and take the opportunity to bench them on Friday night, give them that blessing, because they need it, and I think you need it as well. You need to be able to give it to them. Anyway, after that, there's Kiddush. Right? What are we doing with Kiddush? So I mentioned the other day, when was it? Yesterday, the day before, that Kiddush is actually quite an interesting thing, because under normal circumstances, when you sit down and you have a meal, so you don't make the bracha over wine first, you make the bracha over bread first. And then only afterwards do you make a blessing over the wine inside of the meal. But on Friday night and Shabbos morning, we're going to make Kiddush, which means that we're going to cover the challahs like we mentioned the other day, that the challahs shouldn't get embarrassed. Remember those blushing challahs? Yeah? And we're going to make Kiddush over this cup of wine. Says the Chafetz Chaim. When you think about it for a minute, wine is really the last thing that you should be using on a holy day. Because wine represents everything that can go wrong in the physical world. Right? Remember the story of Noach, when he came out of the ark, the first thing that he planted was a vineyard, and then he got drunk and all kinds of terrible things started happening. So the rabbis say it's not that he shouldn't have planted a vineyard. Of course he should. But, you need to have grapes, but he shouldn't have done that first. First, maybe plant wheat, perhaps, or something that's a little bit more, staple than a vine. Wine represents the concept of the physicality controlling you and not you controlling the physicality. People drink too much and they get drunk and they don't control themselves anymore. It represents people becoming addicted to something. So it's a Chafetz Chaim. Why are we using wine on Friday night and Yom Tov and Shabbos? Why would we do that? So he says a very, very beautiful idea. It's coming to teach us that every dimension of the physical world can be utilized and elevated and turned into a spiritual experience. Even the wine. We're not scared of physicality. Again, in contradistinction to many other religions in the world who are convinced that physicality is something which needs to be ignored, it needs to be utilized as little as possible, because the more physical you are, the less spiritual you are. Judaism says, no, HaKadosh Baruch Hu made us physical beings. He brought us into a physical world. We should enjoy the physicality in the best way that we can, obviously in a kosher way. So says the Chafetz Chaim, no, we're going to take that wine, which represents the physicality of the physical world, of the material world, and we're going to turn that into Kiddush. We're going to sanctify it. We're going to turn it into something which has got a spiritual flavor to it, to show that everything can be made into a spiritual thing. That's also one of the reasons that when you make Kiddush, I don't know if you ever paid attention, but when you make Kiddush, you physically lift the cup up. Right? You're physically elevating it, and you're spiritually elevating it, and you're going to turn it into an experience. And we recite the words of Kiddush, and then we make the bracha over the wine, and then we recite another paragraph, and then at that point, the person who made Kiddush is going to drink from the wine, and then he's going to pour out a little bit for everybody that's sitting there. You don't have to drink it if you don't want to. The only person who's obligated to drink the wine is the person who made the Kiddush.